I'm Skip Williams, and I'm the current president of the Bellingham City Club. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce Chuck Foster, our program committee chair, who is just back from a long-deserved vacation, and he will introduce today's speaker.
Thanks. Do we need the mic? Good afternoon. It's nice to see you all. No, that was not on. Is this better? Yeah, good. Okay. Now, as most of us know, it's sometimes quite interesting to search the internet for background information on people we think we know something about. For instance, I knew that Todd Donovan began teaching at the political science department at Western Washington University in 1991 as an assistant professor. Then he became an associate professor in 1995, and that he achieved the august rank of full professor in 2000. But what I didn't know was that in June of 1999, he was drafted in the 8th round by the San Diego Padres. I mean, who'd have thought that? And then from 1999 until presently, well, he spent 11 years playing outfield in the minor leagues for a variety of teams in such wonderful locations as Idaho Falls, Fort Wayne, Lake Elsinore, Mobile, Midland, and Akron, to name just a few. It's an amazing story. I also didn't know that he is now a scout for the Arizona Diamondbacks, and that his career batting average is .266. Couldn't hit the curveball, and that he bats right and throws right. And now for the real surprise. Todd Donovan is also a baritone with the Florida Lyric Opera Company and is available for parties and bar mitzvahs. Now, of course, I was stunned to learn all this. How is it possible for a person to be so accomplished in 3 very different professions and at the same time in 3 different time zones? Does the professor take the spring and summer quarters off? Do the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, MSNBC, and CNN call him for his election analysis in Poughkeepsie? I was confused until someone I lived with said, "You know, Chuck, perhaps there's more than one Todd Donovan." And then it all made sense. So we are delighted today to have our very own Todd Donovan join us to share his views on what just happened electorally and politically in our country, in our county, our region, and our nation. Our Todd is a nationally recognized expert on such topics and often comments in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Newsday, Washington Post, Boston Globe, Los Angeles Times, it goes on, the Globe and Mail in Canada. He's interviewed on occasion, if not regularly, on MSNBC, Fox News, CNN Radio, KGMI in Bellingham, KPLU in Tacoma, you get the point, and also the Australian Broadcast Corporation. So he's well recognized for his expertise. Our Todd also finds time to be a prolific author of numerous books and articles on our politics, our electoral system, our campaigns, and how our systems compare with those of other countries. In 1995, St. Martin's Press published The Elements of Social Scientific Thinking, a book Todd co-authored with a great friend of the City Club, a former board member and sometime program host and moderator, the late Ken Hoover. Our format today consists of Todd presenting his analysis, our host, that's me, asking a few questions, with a balance of time given over to questions from you, our members. And when you do that, we're going to change our practice. And when it's time, we'll have a microphone set up right behind Robbie there. And so if you have a desire to ask a question, get up and get in line. We're doing that to assist our video production team. All right, that's, so we'll see how that works. So now, please join me in welcoming our very own Todd Donovan.
We could maybe back that up a little bit, because that's really small. And I'm going to be running around the buttons. That Todd, Donovan, the baseball players had me worried. I was telling Chuck this earlier because I don't have a business card. I just say Google Todd Donovan, you can find me. But he was creeping up, and now the guy's like 32 and in the minor leagues, and I think he's kind of done. So now I'm going to try to put the election into perspective and not stand in front of these slides. The little orange form that you've got, I just realized says, today's program help you learn something about a complex public issue, yes or no? So the pressure's on. And I'll give you the 30-second summary of this. It maybe be,
Thank you.
we'll change the next. Okay. There's no mandate for anybody in this election. The results are fairly predictable, and there's no such thing as a Tea Party. That's kind of where I'm going with this. And I mean, everybody probably is aware of how this played out. 60 seats is a huge swing, more than what happened in 1994 in the House. A modest seat gain for the Republicans in the Senate. 11 state legislatures flipped to Republican control, 7 governorships picked up. So, we just look at this is a landslide, this is a mandate or whatever, but I want to, maybe put these results in perspective that we don't necessarily get from television. Everyone remember Ross Perot ran for president? He did that thing with all the charts and graphs, like half-an-hour TV time, bored people to death. It's going to be kind of like that. Less like what you'd get on television or whatever. But these are maybe the questions. Should I keep using this one or do you?
No, who's that one?
This one?
No, who's the one?
Oh, okay. I get it now. That one's for the camera. Okay. But yeah, how do we interpret these results? And we shouldn't take any gloss off the fact that it's a massive defeat for the Democrats. That's pretty obvious. But this is maybe the way it's been spun a lot in the media, that this is a mandate. And you could say the same thing about the 2008 election. Do we interpret that result as a mandate for any particular policies, a referendum on a candidate? Look at some poll data on this sort of stuff. But maybe one of the main themes to take away from this is the geeks who study voting, not necessarily the pundits you hear on TV. Our sense of voters in almost any election context is they're not savvy enough to really evaluate rival platforms from candidates. They don't really know who voted for what bill or another bill most of the time. They just look back and ask themselves the question Ronald Reagan used effectively in 1984, am I better off now than I was 2 years ago or 4 years ago? And they're looking backwards and casting a judgment and anger about the economy. Or a judgment about being happy with the economy. So maybe keep that in mind as we flip through some of this stuff. Another thing I guess we'll maybe try to tease out of here too is, if you look at what happened on the West Coast, the Republican wave didn't really pan out. And I think as of election night, and they're still counting in California, there wasn't a single Democratic incumbent defeated in California, Oregon, Washington, part because there were some strategic retirements and gerrymandering in California that makes it hard to beat anybody. But Harry Reid held onto a seat, Patty Murray held onto her seat, Democrats picked up governor's office in Colorado, I believe that was a flip, held onto the Senate seat there. And one thing that's going on, at least in some of these states, is that attitudes about Obama here, as much as I'm going to say, Obama really wasn't that big of a factor. He was a factor, but this is, the net favorable, unfavorable at the time of the election. These are from CNN exit polls. Obama's 10 points net unfavorable nationally, but still has positives on the West Coast. So, that's maybe got something to do with why you really didn't see that much in the way of seat changes, even in state legislatures, but definitely in the House and the Senate and the West Coast. Nevada, you can look at that and, anyone know how much money was spent in the Nevada Senate race? 60 million or something. So that was more, maybe the race is maybe more nationalized there. But this is, in terms of the question about, and some people have probably seen some of these things, is there a mandate in favor of the party that's now taking control of Congress? this tells you something nationally and what an outlier some of these West Coast states are. This is the net favorable versus unfavorable rating for the, comparing the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. So the bigger the negative number is, the more the Republicans' brand name is disadvantaged relative to the Democrats' brand name. And even nationally, the Democrats' favorables are the Republicans are running a couple of points behind the Democrats in terms of favorability, but huge gaps. And we see these in the polls from Washington that University of Washington folks are doing. I work with these guys on, and these are also the same numbers from the CNN poll. So that, the party that's coming into control of Congress, the House, has even nationally net favorable ratings that are lower than the Democrats. But again, the West Coast is a big outlier here. This didn't get, nobody really talked about this, at least when I was looking at the coverage. All of the networks share the same exit polls because they're really expensive to do. So whether it's the New York Times or CNN or whoever, they all pool their resources for one exit poll. And buried in the stuff from election night, I'm not sure how they do exit polling in Washington. We don't have any polling places, but it's all phone. But there is a question on there that was, is your vote meant to express support for Obama, opposition to Obama, or is Obama not a factor? And the blue bars here are the percentage of people who are saying either they were supporting Obama or, which is the main result nationally on the West Coast, Obama just wasn't a factor. If you actually break down Washington, like 13% said they were voting in the House races to express opposition to Obama, 13% were saying they were expressing support for Obama, and everybody else said it really just wasn't a factor. So you can see nationally there's maybe a third of people who are looking at this as a referendum on Obama, but they're in Pennsylvania, they're in upstate New York, they're in the Rust Belt, and in the South. Out on the West Coast, it's a much different thing, which maybe explains why we didn't see a lot of seats swinging out here. And I couldn't get really good, I can't steal the graphics of the maps from like the New York Times and stuff, but if you look at, the seat losses were fairly regionally specific. Again, trying to get at the, what are voters thinking? What is the mandate that's going on here? All of these polls ask, what's the most important issue on your mind today as you're voting? And not surprisingly, it's the economy. And maybe surprisingly, it's even more so the economy in Washington than it is nationally, because at least nationally, you get maybe about a fifth of people saying they were actually concerned about healthcare, angry about healthcare or something. That was one of their dominant issues. But for most people, it's the jobs, it's the economy. The only other issues that maybe even got close to double digits were immigration and the deficit. But 70+% of people in Washington are saying it's the economy, and healthcare, the national healthcare thing is really not on the radar screen out here. So that's not a really elegant slide, but it's the economy now. It was the economy in 2006, and I'll give you these sort of Ross Pro graphics in a second to show that most every year's House midterm elections are really pretty predictable with how people are assessing the economy or just economic conditions. But those are the numbers on under the 2006 heading there. Those are exit polls from 2006. And one of the standard things we ask people is, are you better off now than you were before? How are your family's finances doing? And what both of these things are trying to show, that both in 2006 and in 2010, if you're pissed off at the economy, you vote against the incumbents. In 2006, the incumbents were the Democrats. In 2010, the incumbents were the Republican. And we see in, I'm sorry, in 2006, the incumbents were the Republicans. 2010, the incumbents are the Democrats. If you're thinking and perceiving that your finances are worse, you're going to take it out on the incumbents. And what maybe the bigger difference is here, the Democrats picked up, 25, 30 seats in 2006 because there weren't as many people angry about the economy taking it out on the incumbents. Now, if you look, there's only half as many people think they're doing better than they were a year ago. Hardly anybody is thinking that the national economy is doing well. But if you think the economy is doing well, you support the incumbents. If you don't think it's doing well, you vote against the incumbents. It's independent of party. And again, that's okay. That's kind of a boring, wonky thing. But it gets to, does anybody have a mandate when they come out of 2006? Does anyone have a mandate when they're coming out of 2010? And this, I still can't get my brain wrapped around how to like empirically test if there is such a thing as the Tea Party. I can't see it in numbers, so I don't believe it exists, even though we got pictures of them. They got a lot of signs. But I guess the question, this is one of the big stories about the 2010 election, right, is it's different. Okay, there's this mandate. It's like an anti-government mandate, and it's emanating from these new forces we call the Tea Party. But we've seen these people, and maybe some of you are part of this group. We've seen them before in every election since I've been alive, and call them Republicans. And they have new signs. But that's maybe being a little bit too flippant. But it's hard to measure this with polls because you ask people like, how much do you support the Tea Party? You can't just ask people, are you a member of the Tea Party? Because it's not really a membership-based group. So the way that, and there are very few polls on this. New York Times did one, and there's a little bit buried in that CNN stuff. And so, we measure if you're a Tea Party person by how strongly affiliated you are with the movement or supportive you are of the movement. So if we break down, people who claim to be Tea Party folks with people who claim to be Republican identifiers, they're demographically almost the same, attitudinally and behaviorally almost the same. So, okay, well, so supposedly part of the story is, but they're bringing new people to the polls. It's this new movement. I've got some data on that in a second, but there's not much. But both, that these are people who behaviorally, they're registered voters who are, longtime Republican voters who are demographically the same as Republican voters. They're not as, if you look at the New York Times poll, they're not anti-government. They're staunchly supportive of their social programs, Medicaid, Social Security. And it's actually, the attitudinal base of it looks very similar to some of the people that came out for Perot in 1992 that then became big in the Republican sort of grassroots movement that helped take over in 1994. But there was the one sort of bullet point here that maybe, so I have a question mark. I don't really think this is something that exists. The 2010 exit poll asked, are you a first-time voter or not? So, if the Tea Party is bringing these new folks out to the polls, we would expect to see maybe more than 3% of people saying that they were first-time voters. That's what the exit poll is showing. And if there are first-time voters who are being mobilized by this new social movement or whatever it is, they'd be breaking heavily towards the Republican Party. We don't see that. Actually, plurality of them are voting Democratic, or at least 50-50. I mean, there's a lot of noise in these exit polls. But what I think that one of the differences between 2006 and 2008 is not that there's this new social force, this Tea Party thing that's changing the dynamic of the electorate. It's a turnout effect, and I'll try to show some of this in a second here. That in these other elections where the Democrats were gaining a lot of seats, you had a lot of younger voters. 18% of the electorate in 2008, that's a lot of young voters. 12% of the electorate in 2010, it's a smaller electorate. That's not a lot of young voters. I mean, it's a turnout demographic effect. We're not seeing the mobilization of new voters here. We did see a mobilization of new voters in 2008, younger voters, and they stayed home in 2010, which intuitively I think everybody kind of understands that. But there's nothing in there that really adds up to think that there's, at the mass level, this kind of mobilization of new voters. In terms of candidate selection and within the Republican Party, that's obviously there's a dynamic going on there, but it's sort of the same inter-party fight that's been going on for decades maybe within the party. Again, in terms, I just had this one. I think I showed this one. This is redundant. Is there a mandate? The only thing, the dominant thing, again, that everybody's saying in the polls is it's the economy. And it did have that one up there before. So it's sort of getting at a different, we also asked, this is the CNN stuff. What do you think Congress should be doing when it comes into session in 2011? What's the highest priority for the new Congress? Reduce the deficit and spend money to create jobs, which of course are completely contradictory. Policy goals are the dominant responses that people give. And these aren't open-ended responses. There's only so many options that the survey responses were given. But Democrats say spend money to create jobs. Republicans say cut the deficit. There's not a majority, either nationally, there is in Colorado, of people saying that healthcare should be repealed. In the national samples and in all the West Coast state samples, there are majorities who say either expand healthcare or leave it alone. But as we saw from the other slide before this, it's really not a priority to anybody. That just happened to be one of the response categories in the survey. Cut taxes in the national survey doesn't hit 20% in terms of, this is Democrats and Republicans, this is and independents and everybody. So people don't really care about healthcare. They don't really care about cutting taxes. They care about the economy. And you all probably know this, but there's my nice Ross Perot kind of like a heart attack or something. This is the trend in how the president's party does in midterm elections going back to the Depression. And the 60-seat loss for 2010 is kind of a moving target because we're still counting. It's going to be 64 probably that the Democrats will lose, which is a lot of seats. But what I'm trying to, if I had a little laser pointer thing, I could try to show here. This is what's predictable about midterm elections. The president's party always loses seats in midterm elections, and it's part of this kind of turnout phenomena, surge and decline. You get the presidential election mobilizes some demographic group, comes out in 2008 or 1932, and then they stay home 2 years later. And this has been going on long before 2010. The low point here is, well, that's the last midterm for Hoover. The Democrats then, with Roosevelt in 32, get lots of seats, and then 2 years later, they lose lots of seats because they've got lots of seats to lose. Next presidential election, they come back up again, and then a lot of those supporters stay home. And you see this pattern with some oscillations going on. And knowing this, the average, so this is me as a genius making predictions in my elections class. I thought they were all seniors and they'd be gone by the time the election played out. So like, well, they're going to lose at least 24 seats, maybe 35. And that was the prediction that that most people are making based on these sort of trends over last spring or into the summer. There's another way to put it into perspective. This is, rather than looking at the number of seats, the percentage of the president's party seats that are lost. And when you look at it this way, 2010 doesn't look that unusual. It looks kind of like 1958, like 1938. The Democrats had gained so many seats in 2006 and 2008, they had a lot more to lose. And as I'll show they're gaining these in what tend to be the marginal areas. But so, it's an interesting election. It probably will, almost 25% seat loss, but it's not that big of an anomaly going back to 1938 or 1930 even. So I think I predict, it'll be like 35 seats. That's what all the models show. Wednesday morning, I'm walking across campus, and one of those students, there's no one on campus at 8 o'clock except one of those students. He's like, 35 seats, right, Donovan? I thought they'd all have graduated by then. So, and I'll come back to that. That is one of the most interesting things about this election is why did it end up being so much more than what we thought it would have been a year, a year ago. Historic trends would say, yeah, the Democrats are going to lose 25 seats. 62, 63, how do we get there? But this is I think CNN just released this Monday or Tuesday, where they've asked after the fact, this is like last week, I guess, they're surveying, asking people, do you think the election was a mandate? That's my point. Elections rarely, if ever, are mandates. And they've asked this, they reword it depending on which party's in power, in 1994 or 2006 or 2010, and say, yeah, it's a mandate for this party that's coming in, or no, it's just a vote against the party that's in power. And if anything, 2010 is the weakest. There never is any sense, at least in the public, that what just happened is an endorsement of the challengers, the people who are taking on the incumbents. It's a rejection of the incumbents, maybe now more than ever. And that's just a likely voter sample. Same kind of thing going back to 1994. Was this a vote against the president? So in 1994, you're talking about Clinton. In 2006, you're talking about Bush. In 2010, you're talking about Obama. Or was it, do you look at the midterm election as a vote against the incumbent party's policies in Congress? I'm not sure how that was worded. Or is it an endorsement of the out-of-power party that's challenging the incumbents? you know, Obama's, as much as this, some people are saying, yeah, it's kind of a referendum on Obama, it doesn't look as much like 2006 was for Bush or 94 was for Clinton, and Clinton got reelected. But you know, that's the boring part of the story that doesn't really make for, you know, pundits yelling at each other on television or what. But you know, we have this ebb and flow, that, you know, that sort of surge and decline in the electorate where there's tens and tens and tens of millions of voters who came out in 2008 or who came out in 2004. They don't show up in these midterms. Those are the independents who, you know, they kind of go whichever way the wind's going with the economy. Maybe, or they, you know, they get excited by a particular presidential campaign and then they just don't show up. But that, you know, that's a part of the story that we really can't forget. And I also think, like, you know, if you look at the vote totals, like all these people who are losing seats right now, you know, they got like 40% more votes 2 years ago when they ran and won than when they ran this time and lost. Because there's just so much, that makes sense? There's so fewer voters. The people beating them are getting, I should say, like 40% fewer votes in 2010 than the people that they're defeating got in 2008. And you know, the same thing happens in these midterms off and on. But once those people are in office long enough, you know, they get incumbent advantage that maybe let them survive the next surge and decline or whatever. But anyone see this? I think Tim Johnson had this in the Weekly. It's a great piece of political science geek graphics here. For a guy named John Sides put this thing together. But it gives us a sense of what's going to maybe be happening in the next session of Congress. The people who lose, not surprisingly, are those sort of brighter red dots. People who are representing districts that were just sort of 50-50 Democratic Republican. I mean, they could, you know, they're this so-called swing districts or marginal districts or whatever, right? Those are the seats that were Republican in 2006 and 2008 that the Democrats picked up. They're the seats that the Republicans are picking up now. And for the most part, in the state legislature here in Washington, you're kind of seeing the same thing. You know, it's Bellevue, Kirkland, Bothell, and the 42nd for some reason. Oh, thank you, yeah. This is the percent vote for Obama in 2008, and that's the Democratic House candidate's share of the two-party vote this election. So, you know, if you're in a 50% district, you're really vulnerable. If you're in a safe Democratic district or a safe Republican district, you know, nothing's really happened. What's sort of interesting about this year is you know, some years those marginal seats are held by people who are very, you know, even though it's a 50-50 district, maybe they're really right-wing Republican or really, you know, left-wing Democrat. Most of these Democratic incumbents are the blue dogs or the yellow dogs, the conservative Democrats. That's going to make the Democratic caucus much more ideologically cohesive, you know, more liberal than it was, you know, in total. And unlike the Democrats' candidates in 06 and 08, if the Tea Party candidates are more conservative, the Republicans, then even though they're going to be bigger, are going to have the center of gravity maybe, you know, going even farther right, which means that those people might be vulnerable in 2012, but it also means that as polarized as Congress has been, it can only get worse. And that's a whole other set of really boring slides. This is something, I don't know how many people have been following this. You know, one of the big things that the people inside the parties are following is, well, if you get the party control of state governors and legislatures changing, we're doing redistricting, like starting in January or February or something like that. The states that are shaded here are the ones that are actually getting new congressional districts, and the ones, you know, the old Rust Belt or whatever, the ones that are kind of highlighted there are losing seats. There really wasn't much change. There was a lot of change in partisan control of state legislatures and governors, but not really in the states that are getting new seats. Whereas the Republicans did take over Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana. Montana only has one seat. You can't really gerrymander that one. But so you know, the change here will be the Republicans are in a stronger position to kind of like divide the shrinking totals in some of these states that the Democrats would have really controlled before. Nothing's really changed in these other states. And so, you know, it matters who controls these things, but it wasn't the big landslide that we think. Okay, I think I only have a couple more of these. I might just skip to, I'm going to get to some Washington specific stuff. Those dots are various political science geeks' predictions of how many seats the Democrats were going to lose. I mean, the assumption is we knew they were going to lose. The orange dots were predictions made in like September. 218 is, you know, you've lost your majority. This is how much you're losing your majority. And the actual election result is that orange square, which you probably can't see as a square from way back there, but kind of up at the top. But the point is, every model underestimated, except this one guy, Jay Coast, who I don't know who he is. Every model underestimated, particularly ones like a month ago. Why, and I haven't really said much about this, that, you know, the fundraising differences between the party, turnout, those sort of things don't get factored into these models. And so, you know, the enthusiasm gap maybe was real in some places, and that didn't enter into these models. The polls, so this is a contradiction. I'm good at doing that. This is, you know, the political scientists systematically underestimated how many seats the Republicans were going to pick up. The polls systematically overestimated the Republican vote share in all the competitive Senate races, like way beyond these. You know, the average, you know, going into the election from the last several polls done in all these states had like Joe Miller winning Alaska by 10 points. He lost by lots. Boxer was, you know, predicted to be much closer in California. Harry Reid was going to lose in Nevada. And I don't know, I'm just throwing this out, I don't know why, but it's not just any one particular polling outfit. They were all systematically bad at predicting Democratic vote share in these, underestimating Democratic vote share in the Senate races. And the Senate ended up not being the blowout that had originally been predicted. Okay, last 5 minutes. What about Washington? You know, I've sort of thrown this out. There was a different dynamic out west. That, you know, west of the Rockies, it was a really normal, kind of tepid midterm election where even Harry Reid got reelected, despite $30 million, you know, thrown into just against him or whatever. You know, much less evidence that there's any referenda on Obama or health care. And I'm saying there wasn't much of that nationally, even much less of it here. Throwing out a couple things of Washington to maybe finish this off with. There's a great resource, the WashingtonPoll.org, where every now and again we scrape up enough money to do a statewide survey, which, you know, a lot of states this size don't have any resource like that. But tracking trends in party identification. Do you think of yourself as a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, or what? You know, we see a blip towards the Republicans in, you know, self-identification as partisans in 2010, but it really looks like it's coming more out of, you know, the independents. The black line there bounces around a lot. You know, some years it's not cool to call yourself Republican. Some years it's not cool to call yourself Democrat. So you say you're an independent. But, you know, it's not looking like that big of an anomaly compared to the long-term trend here. No realignment or anything like that. The blue line in this graph is the percentage of seats the Democrats control in the state Senate. I'm sorry, the blue line is the House, the red line is the Senate, going back to 1974. And the 0.5 would be, you know, where you have a majority. You know, the Democrats lost seats, but they lost seats that they had picked up that they didn't really have much business having in 2008. Or, you know, seats that are going to be bouncing back and forth. But, you know, this is 1994. That, you know, that was the big blowout when the Republicans cleaned up and clocked the Democrats nationally in 1994. They cleaned up in Washington. They took a majority of our state congressional delegation. They just blew the Democrats out of the water in the state House. There's nothing like that going on this year. So you know, it's a different dynamic here compared to the rest of the nation. It's a different dynamic here than it was in 1994. That doesn't mean people are happy. This is, you know, we don't usually see nice, clean trends like this. Since 2006, as the economy has been getting, you know, progressively worse and not better. The blue line is percentage of people approving Gregoire. The red line is percentage of people approving the legislature. That's down to like 30% now. And the black line is the state on the right track or the wrong track, and that's the percent saying right track, which is a surrogate measure for people who are worried about the economy. So, you know, that as much as you're not seeing big changes in terms of partisan control, you are seeing a real souring of everybody's attitudes toward everything. I think this is my last one. Oh, I got this one and then one last one. And this is why. I mean, in 2006, if I didn't put it on here. You probably can't read the font. But the dominant issue that drove people towards the Democrats and voted out Republican state legislators was the Iraq War, which most of those people in Olympia probably had little to do with. But it was an issue that drove people to vote for the Democrats in 2006. 2010, we have like 1% of people citing the Iraq War or the Afghanistan War or any kind of war. It's 50% of people are now saying it's the economy. Taxes, healthcare, everything else is off the table. It's the economy here more than it is even maybe nationally, because these other issues that might be divisive nationally are just off the chart here. The last one, Matt Barretto put this in, I think, in the October poll. The net favorability ratings of Washington politicians, and threw Palin in there just for the heck of it. But Patty Murray's positives and negatives are just, they're 45-45, so it's 0. Gregoire's a couple points into the negative, as is Rossi. Obama's, these are Washington poll data, not CNN data, but Obama in the Washington poll is like 10 points net positive. Rob McKenna, the guy's off the charts. The people whom he's got this huge positive advantage, and also about 13 or 20% of people haven't heard of him. But if you're the future of the Republican Party, that's the most popular polling a Republican or anybody in Washington right now. Okay, I'll leave it with that. What's going to happen in 2012? You guys can answer that. But this is getting to be redundant. But if the economy recovers, 2012 is going to look like all these other years where presidents get reelected and their party comes back. If the economy doesn't recover, that's kind of a boring story. But I think that's the story. So I'm done. Can I turn this off now?
Thank you, Todd. And we'll ask questions from here. So I'm going to try and model how that works. One of the things you focused on was the difference between the West Coast and the rest of the country in certain key areas, support for Obama for one. Do you have a scientific, political science view of why that is? And if you don't, just tell us what you think.
Yeah, no, I don't have it. Well, there's more Democrats out here. That's buried under all these data. But it's not just, even in Utah, Obama's favorabilities, there are not a lot of Democrats there, but he has net favorable evaluations among Republicans you wouldn't expect. I've published a paper, this is a long story, but the states that have more white voters living near African-American voters have worse opinions about Obama. I mean, there might be a racial dimension in some of it, above and beyond partisanship. So, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Obama's never been as popular in those places as John Kerry even was. But that's a whole other story. But yeah, but on the West Coast, that kind of racial dimension is removed, and there's more Democrats who are more liberal, so he polls better.
Okay, another topic entirely. What effect do you think the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Citizens United had on our recent election, if any?
Yeah, and I had like one little bullet point in there where, it's hard to say, because that might explain why was it 60 seats instead of 45 or 50 or whatever a lot of these models were predicting. But the Democrats actually were matching the spending towards the end of it. They were outspent, and Democratic-affiliated groups, labor, in the last 2 weeks were getting pretty close, if not outspending in some states. So it'll take a long time to untangle that. But it definitely changes the way campaigns are conducted.
Was there a lot more money spent this time?
There was double the record, and there's a lot more money spent by groups that aren't disclosing who their donors are. Although out of was it like 600 billion was that the amount? I didn't look it up. A fairly small proportion of that was money from groups that weren't reporting. And they were going to spend a lot of money on this election, regardless of Citizens United. But it's too early for me to guess.
Okay, on a different topic. Did you see a qualitative difference between this round of politicking and prior rounds in terms of heavy reliance on media perhaps, or little engagement with voters, or was there more name calling, more blaming this time, or is that just part of our process?
Are you saying you're going to give me the hard questions or the easy questions? Was it more negative?
Right, essentially.
The more money that gets spent by outside groups, whether they're disclosing or not, the more negative ads you get. So just, you know, I haven't seen content analysis of this stuff, but I mean, we know that when candidates are dominating the campaign with their own money, they say, you know, here's me with my cow on my farm and I'm great. When it's the Chamber of Commerce or SEIU running the ads, it's almost all negative. So there was a lot more of that money, so there's probably a lot more negative. And the paradox of that is people then become much more interested and aware of the campaign, and they hate both of the candidates. And we do know that from looking at the 2006 election. So there was probably a lot more awareness and animosity this year because of that money.
Interesting. Okay, I'm done. Now it's the time for our members, or lacking members, in lieu of members. I'm sorry. Anyone else who'd like to ask a question? So please come up. Marion, you're not doing it? Okay. Marion?
We do both? Todd, could you talk a little bit about the Moxie Media scandal, and specifically what I'm curious about is traditionally dirty tricks have been fairly partisan, and I think this caught a lot of folks off guard. So is there a perception problem about dirty tricks, and also for those folks that don't know about Moxie?
Yeah, Moxie is a consultant ad shop. Should I use this one? That is often hired by Democratic candidates' campaigns to do mailings, coordinate campaign work, all that sort of stuff, and which is a fairly common thing in this state. People that want to send out, you know, hit pieces or whatever, or in this case, I think they're trying to like help a candidate to siphon votes away from a Democratic candidate in a primary, but they didn't disclose that, you know, the bogus group they set up, Citizens for a Great Planet or whatever, which you can do and then funnel money through, but they didn't disclose that to the PDC, and are going to be fined hopefully heavily for that. But yeah, that stuff's, it's not that uncommon. It's just usually done in a way that the state says as long as you disclose to the state what's going on, it's okay. But this one was maybe, I think it was sort of egregious because they were actually trying to torpedo one candidate to help another candidate and hide where the money was coming from. That part's maybe a little less common than just trying to hide where the money comes from, which is fairly common, I think. And legal, if you just disclose that your bogus group actually has an address somewhere.
I assume that I assume gerrymandering has played some role in what seems to be increasing polarization. Can you give us some historical perspective on all of that, and also talk about what other factors may be contributing to polarization?
Yeah, by gerrymandering, I mean drawing district lines so that a congressional seat is, you know, a district that's 80% Republican or 80% Democrat, so therefore is only going to produce representatives who are very ideologically to the left if they're Democrats and to the right if they're Republicans. That's getting worse. I guess one of the questions, I mean, there's no moderates in the House anymore. The median Republican in the previous session of Congress was that guy who was trying to raise money by fighting having Korans being used to swear people into the House. That was ideologically the median Republican. The ideological median Democrat was Patrick Kennedy, the guy, one of the Kennedys, very liberal. You know, there's no one in the middle in the House. Is that like because you're consciously drawing the district lines a particular way, or is it because we just keep, as people, we live around people like us more than we used to? You can't draw a competitive district in Seattle. You know, you can't carve out a 50-50 Democrat-Republican district in Eastern Washington. It's really hard because there aren't enough people geographically where you need them. So yeah, I mean, yeah, it's going on, it's getting worse, but is it because of the way we consciously draw the lines, which is what's going on in like California and Texas, or is it just because even in other places, it's hard to find anywhere where, you know, what neighborhoods in Whatcom County do you find half the neighbors are Democrat and half of them are Republican, and you could create a balanced competitive district. It's really hard to do.
Even here, where it's a bipartisan.
Yeah, anywhere it's hard, and that's changed. I think that that's maybe something more for the demographers and stuff. But that I think generations ago there were more intermixing politically, at least geographically, than there is now. So combine that with gerrymandering, and then you get polarization.
I usually, I never see this guy at work because he's always around the country talking to people more important. But, and I'm such a hopeless ideologue, this guy's all, does it by the numbers. So I want to ask you a question. So the parties in office are polarized, the people are not. But we're left with what the party activists produce for us out of primaries and that sort of thing. And we have a number of problems like reorganizing the economy, energy, foreign policy and all that kind of stuff that requires some kind of bipartisanship. Do you think that the American people will ever figure out how to elect people to go back there that'll really seriously grapple with these problems, or will the dysfunction just become worse?
No, yes. Well, no, it's not.
I try to egg him on, but I can't.
Well, because this segues from this question. It's not that the people can't find somebody who might be closer to where the center of public opinion is in the country. There's no institutional mechanisms that let those people get elected, really. And one of the, I don't know if I buy this, but one of the reasons people are promoting that our top two system in California is adopting it as a primary system is like, well, that would maybe produce people who aren't just selected by the extremes of either party. But so there's that institutional problem. Then if you take all that away, the money that the candidates depend on that help them get elected comes from very polarized groups. So one of the arguments in political science is the polarization's there at the elite level. Not as much at the mass public level, but is it driven by donors? Is it driven by the closed primary systems? Is it driven by gerrymandering? But that so until you fix all that stuff, it's hard to get. How would you run for office as a moderate centrist independent? You couldn't raise money. You couldn't win a primary, and therefore there are none of them in Congress.
Both of them then? Okay. Have you had a chance to look at the 42nd district, bringing it down to the local level? What happened there?
I knew someone was going to ask that. And this actually, I can give the plug for the Citizens Election Advisory Commission, which Marion asked me to give a plug for, is something that Shirley Forsloff has set off, where we have a great group of citizen observers, party observers watching every stage of their very transparent recount process, so that we can sit here confidently probably say, nothing's going to change in this recount because they're really good at counting the ballots. But that's not it. Your answer, your question is more like, why did it trend Republican when we don't see that trend so much on the rest of the West Coast? I don't know. I mean, it makes complete sense to see the Democrats losing state legislative seats in Bothell and Kirkland and Bellevue and these places that were Republican until 06 or 08. Those would be the ones that they're losing now. But I don't know, I haven't looked at how much the spending was. I have not seen the Republican candidate. He's maybe got some great appeal to people that I wasn't around. Linville's maybe getting some cost for being associated with the budget, but that's all just guessing. I mean, that's probably the last seat. There was a lot of money spent in it, but it's an outlier compared to the other seats that flipped statewide.
Are there any other questions? Yes. It's on.
Okay, thank you. So Todd, I felt really special over the last couple of months. I've received calls from, let's see, Barack and Joe and Nancy and Sarah and Newt, and it seems like daily I get calls from Carl. And even while I was at the victory or defeat party on election night, I even got a call at home asking me who I was going to vote for Republican president in 2012 as a robocall. So my question to you, are robocalls that effective in your mind, and should I use them next year when I run?
Actually, the volume of robocalls this year shows that they were spending so much money they didn't have to target. Usually, you know, you're identified in a database. Well, I could guess how you're identified in a database as a voter. Usually, you'd be filtered out and you wouldn't be getting the calls for the Republicans. They had so much money this year. You're getting mail and robocalls from both sides. That, you know, that was whether there's experimental work where they try to figure out what messages work in terms of getting people to turn out, not how they vote, but where they actually show up and vote. And the ones I've seen don't put much stock in robocalls. It's face-to-face contacts. But you know, if they didn't work, people wouldn't be spending all that much money on it. Election night, Oscar, yeah.
Yeah, I got to do both. Okay. Oh, they both. Okay, great. I have a question that doesn't go to this election, but it goes to the trend of elections. And I don't know if you read the article in January's Atlantic, January 2010, by James Fallows. It was the cover article, and he was talking about, is America in decline compared to China? And he said, for every decade that this republic has existed, somebody's been saying, we're going to hell in a handbasket. But he did identify two significant risks for our society. One of them was that if we don't maintain the preeminent level of quality in our premier institutions of higher learning, we're in deep shit, and or doo-doo, and perhaps more importantly, from my perspective, and this takes a much more longitudinal kind of perspective, I think. And he came to the conclusion that given the problems that we face in the country, whether they be economic, whether they be social, that need to be addressed on a national level, that we have become ungovernable. And that our system, as constructed, as it exists in our Constitution, results in a nation that is simply unable to grapple with and therefore address problems. For example, climate change. For example, baby boomer Social Security related issues. For example, taxation reform that has anything to do with the demand for, on the one hand, government needs to create more jobs by spending more money. Secondly, they need to cut taxes and or they need to reduce the deficit. What about this? I didn't mean to make a speech, but I always do. But the real question I have is, what about this issue? Are we ungovernable?
Yeah, I mean that's an argument that people have been making for constitutional, well, people that write political science texts that nobody reads. The Madisonian system of built-in deadlock was designed to do exactly what it's doing. And it's led to bloody civil wars, and it's led to an inability to pass legislation. The only time you get any kind of non-incremental policy change is maybe once or twice a century. Takes something like a Great Depression. I read the article. I kind of agree with him. But the conservative perspective would be, I'm not maybe this good at this, but that's valuable because you don't want stuff to be changing all the time. But without constitutional reform, there's probably some things that could maybe make things more governable. And I think when we talk about polarization, that this touches into it. That if, unlike any other representative assembly in the world, our representatives are so dependent on really narrowly based interests that fund them. What they do here would be illegal in most established democracies. And that, it's not just the gerrymandering, but it's the donor bases of both parties that really pull them, and the constant, the campaign cycle then being 24/7 all the time. Maybe I'm overly romantic, but I think if you change that, you could maybe change some things. Was just today, the START treaty that everybody was in complete consensus with, a couple of weeks ago. Now it's like, well, that's going to be a place to fight about. So yeah, it's.
Just to loop back to the polarization issue, Do we have in any kind of recent history a similar kind of a setup? And if this seems to continue in the short run, do you see it in the long run? Is there any way out of it because of the issues related to gerrymandering and so forth?
I've done trends of the stuff just through the 20th century, and it's been pretty much steadily throughout the 20th century and into the last decade where the polarization in floor votes on Congress have grown. In the 70s, believe it or not, it was at a fairly low point because you had lots of conservative Democrats from the South and moderate Republicans from the Northeast. The big thing that changed was the party system, not really how we draw districts or money became a much bigger issue in campaigns since the 70s. But if there's something else, a cleavage issue that sort of redefines the parties regionally, then maybe you get, liberal Republicans getting elected again or conservative Democrats getting elected again. But that's what got crossover voting in the 1970s. Nobody could even place Richard Nixon ideologically nowadays. Or the Congress of that era that gave us, the EPA and stuff like that. They wouldn't fit in the party system we have today. But a different issue could shake up things and maybe redefine geographically where the parties are coming from and who they're electing. But I don't know what that issue would be. But that's what happened in the 60s. It was civil rights that kind of seems like it drove the Democrats, conservative Democrats out of the party. And so we've been more polarized since then.
No more questions. So now it's time. I know you think you're done, but there's one more thing. We have this wonderful, we think it's a wonderful tradition of giving a gift to our presenter. In this case, you. Welcome Places 2.
Oh, awesome.
On behalf of the Bellingham City Club, we thank you very much for your appearance.
Oh, thanks, Chuck. That was fun. What am I wired to?